We're continuing our conversation on AI power players shaping the future with Scott Hart.
So as supply and demand tightens in real time, you mentioned the three levels of kind of emergency demand response. And how does this bill address that participation from the data center versus, let's say, the traditional grid customer? And I got to think Winter Storm Uri played into some of the logic here about how different customers were impacted through rotational outages and some not having to leave the grid at all. That was quite controversial. Can you kind of talk about, did that logic make its way into thinking about a better way to manage a scarcity event or a tightening of the grid?
It absolutely did. Texans were unfortunately became familiar with what we in the business would call EEA3, or involuntary load shed, during Winter Storm Uri several years ago. And when you reach that emergency level, you're really talking about being short of supply to cover all demand that's being bid into the system, and that means rolling blackouts. And unfortunately, during Winter Storm Uri, the gap was so large that it became next to impossible in the early period of the event to rotate those outages. And in particular, what had occurred was that large customers directly connected to the transmission system, because the transmission system was considered so critical to keep into operation, a lot of those large customers never had their power interrupted at all. Their fair share of outages instead were allocated back to other customers on the distribution system, in other words, disproportionately to residential and small commercial customers. That was a deeply unfair outcome in a very terrible event. I think we can all agree in retrospect.
Yeah.
And so one of the best things, and hopefully it never has to be relied upon, but one of the things this bill does is to require these large load customers above 75 megawatts in size to actually have relay equipment that can cause them to be disconnected from the grid during an EEA3 event. So in other words, there'll be a more equitable system of rotating outages. So that's the stick. That's the button that can be pushed to unload those customers. But there's also a carrot in Senate Bill 6. It sets up a new demand response product in the ERCOT market to induce voluntary participation by more price-sensitive data centers before that event even happens. And in exchange for compensation, they'll be able to back off the grid earlier in time, and that way, again, in the name of being a good grid citizen, hopefully not impose any negative reliability effects onto the grid in circumstances like these.
Yeah, I think because rotational outages are so few and far between historically, well, they're more common now, that most grid customers today don't realize, that's a thing, and that they are literally the last line of defense between a complete blackout. So having, more equitable participation was a big part of the thinking here. And I think that's good news. So we talked about demand response. We've talked about on-site backup generation as being ways to, help provide grid reliability. And I think those are a great start. And I think you're going to see more and more of that being a part of the solution. But even with that at more scale, we still need more supply. So how are you thinking about, and what does this bill, really support about bringing more supply of generation of any flavor, gas, renewables, nuclear, go down the list, batteries, things like that? What did the bill do for that?
Yeah, a couple things. One on SB 6 and then one on another piece of legislation that made its way through the process. First, SB 6 required that existing power plants that want to sidle up to these new large loads go through a study to ensure that there aren't any problems with that marriage, that behind-the-meter co-location. That's a nudge in the direction of getting new generation online, for sure. Though, to be clear, the law doesn't prevent existing generators from entering into power purchase agreements with these data centers. And meanwhile, through a separate appropriation, the Texas legislature decided to go ahead and fully fund the so-called Texas Energy Fund, which is $10 billion for electricity projects, most of it going to new generation in the ERCOT market. And that's a revolving loan program that channels low interest rates and capital into new power plants. As you know, we have 3 power plants in that program, one of which has signed a deal done and dated, T.H. Wharton, with 2 more on deck. So it's not a grant, it's not free money, but it is a source of lower interest capital in an environment with a higher cost of capital. And in exchange for that, companies like NRG that receive this loan are obligated to offer that power generation into the ERCOT market. So we would be prevented from doing a behind-the-meter deal with that power generation of the data center. And then we also have to agree to a performance standard to basically have that power generation available for a certain amount of time over the 2-decade period that the loan covers. So it's a give and a get. It's again not free money, not even a subsidized interest in view of the requirements that are imposed upon the people who take it. But it is yet another tool that number one, speaks to Texas's support for new generation and its desire to see new stuff come online, but also it helps clarify sort of the possible generation projects that are going to be, first in time over the next few years. TEF is by no means going to cover all of the generation that's needed to supply a load forecast like even 10% of the one we're seeing. But it's helpful in at least sort of guiding which projects are in the queue and getting through it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that the impetus for that was coming out of Uri and just trying to understand what else we could do to firm up the grid. And now 4 years later, we're finally, moving dirt and the projects are underway. So it's somewhat illustrative of, how long it takes for, again, stakeholders to come together to effectuate change in the power industry. And that is a tiny element relative to, or endeavor relative to what we're seeing from this AI revolution, not only in the Texas markets, but across the country. So that leads me to my next question is, we cover Texas. It feels like, centered around the existing grid customers and being a good grid citizen collectively, all of us, that they came up with a compromise more or less between everyone, but seems like it's set up a really good framework. Are there things, elements, components that you're seeing being talked about that lean into some of these strategies that we talked about on SB6 that potentially could be adopted at the state level? And yes, it gets more complicated because power markets or ISOs like PJM have 13 states that have to come together to do things. New York is New York, so it's one state, one ISO. California, same thing. So in general, these concepts, do you think they have legs in other markets?
I do. Certainly around the need to hone in on load forecasting to get real about what we're probably going to see. And then at some relevant stage in the process to make these projects kind of put money where their mouth is. All of that is a common issue of concern across all states. And ideally, states would naturally coalesce around a policy solution that, if not identical across states, would kind of look similar. And they would actually engage in some level of information sharing because the shopping around that data centers do. It's not like they know the boundaries or respect the boundaries of the power markets, right? To the earlier point we were talking about, now in ERCOT, if you've got 5 projects under development in ERCOT, but only one realistically is going to go forward, ERCOT will know that. But it may not be the case that, PJM will know the information out of ERCOT or vice versa. And so considering this is not, not even just a national, but a global market, the more information that can go to those grid planners to hone in on their load forecasts, the better they're going to be able to tie down the realistic expectations of what the grid needs to look like. And that's valuable information that comes to us in the competitive power generation community too, who's looking for something real to invest in. But ultimately, as you know, there's not going to be a substitute for, credit-worthy parties coming together in the form of a contract, where I owe you something, and if I don't provide it, I pay you damages. And if you don't buy it, consistent with the contractual terms, you nevertheless owe me something. And that's kind of something that I wouldn't say state law requires, but it already exists, and state law continues to accommodate that competitive market structure. So I think the one lesson we can take out of it from our competitive side of the business to certain other states, maybe the regulated utility states where the utilities do the power generation too, is probably a bit of skepticism in view of all this uncertainty that you would let regulated utilities effectively, candidly, fight out of the pocketbooks of their legacy customers in competition for this demand. It's much better, and the thing that Senate Bill 6 continues to respect in the ERCOT market structure is this kind of arm's length dealing between people like yourself, Scott, and data center customers. Whereas in a lot of these states, there's a third person in the room backstopping those deals, and it's the captive base of customers. And that's not a good outcome. And it's something that SB 6 has sort of lessons to inform.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we have to be, very conscious of the implications on the existing grid customers and higher costs, lower reliability, cross subsidization. You get on the list of things that, on one hand, we really need the AI economy, arms race with China, economic prosperity, national security. There's a lot of macro reasons driving why we want to advance and lead in this space. I think the current administration's, certainly pushing aggressively there. And, the next topic for our next podcast is to introduce it. We're going to do something similar on the big, beautiful bill and, see if we can derive some more clarity out of that. SB 6 in Texas, and then potentially, iterations of that in other places. I do think provide us some framework there. But next time we'll dig into the big, beautiful bill and see how that will or will not provide some more clarity on how things are going. And that's one of the things that we really need around the stakeholder group. So Travis, thank you for joining me. Stay tuned. You guys will be back with another episode shortly.
Like this episode, leave a comment, and thanks for joining.